What is up, everybody, and welcome to another World of Warcraft live developer Q&A. My name is Josh Allen, aka Community Manager Lore, joined here today by Game Director Ion Hazzikostas. Ion, thank you so much for joining us here.
Hey Josh, great to be here again with our new fancier setup.
Yeah, shiny new I can't wait to find out what I'm going to break in this one. Yeah. It's bound to be something at some point.
It'll be an adventure.
It'll be an adventure indeed. So we got a lot of questions to get through today. I do want to make one call out real quick before we get started. Just I know we got a lot of questions that came in about Rise of Azara, which is the upcoming content update for World of Warcraft. We're not quite ready to talk too much about that, so I apologize that we're not going to dig too deeply in any questions about Rise of Azara. There'll probably be bits and pieces here.
Yeah, I'm going to probably mention some stuff where it's relevant to questions, but in terms of like the big info dump on the latest, what's changed since BlizzCon, and the details on some of the features that you heard about at BlizzCon, that's going to be coming very soon.
Yep.
But not quite yet.
Oh, very, very soon. So let's get into our first question. This one comes from Vero, who asked, the 100% loot RNG in the game with caches, personal loot, and trading restrictions, no Valor vendors, no upgrade, RNG sockets, Titan Force, Warforge. Can you comment on any areas you'd like to lessen RNG and increase player agency?
Yeah, obviously this is a hot topic. We hear this discussed a ton, get a lot of feedback on it, and there's a lot of different pieces to this question and the topic to unpack. Randomness has been a part of loot acquisition in World of Warcraft since the beginning, and I think in most MMOs, most RPGs, there's some chance of things have the possibility of dropping something. You don't always get what you want, and we've tried in different ways to mitigate that over the years. And more recently, we have things like the Residuum vendor to help make Azeroth armor from Mythic Plus in particular more acquirable and more targetable for folks who want a specific piece. Because we know we're pulling from a very large pool of items, you don't really have a sense of control over what you're going to get. And of course, there's some things like crafted pieces where you can get a very high quality Mythic grade level piece in a specific slot. But I think that this broad topic is the result of the overall direction that Imization has taken over the past several years. I think at this point in WoW, we have more different viable loot acquisition paths than ever before. Whether it's in parallel, Mythic Plus, raiding, PvP, all of which are giving gear that can be universally useful. Whereas in the past, going back a few years, it was basically you had to raid to get the best gear, and then PvP had its own separate gear path with PvP stats that wasn't as useful. And so there were fewer items to really deal with. You might look at a given tier and only have 2 or 3 items total that you could aim for, maybe even just one. And so if you got the item, you were happy and you got it, and if you didn't, you didn't. Whereas these days, it's much more common to see good loot that isn't the precise good loot that you need. Whether it's getting something from your cache that's not quite the thing you were hoping for, or you get something, but you already had a Warforged piece in that slot, and it feels like these extra layers of randomness.
Right.
That's something we want to do more, to help mitigate. I think certainly the Mythic Plus weekly cache is an area where there's the potential for a lot of pretty bad feeling if you get bracers 3 weeks in a row from the cache, let's say, or really any slot. That would require some tech on our part that we're actually actively working on to have some history and some sense of control. It's different than the bad luck protection that we've done in the past. We want to have some memory of what you've gotten from these sources so that we can minimize the chance of the really negative feeling bad luck there. But overall though, there is still a very strong correlation between overall power level, the gear that you get, and the content that you're doing. If you look at the best geared guilds in the world and the groups in the world, they are pretty much one for one all folks who are in the Hall of Fame, have cutting edge, are 9 of 9, Mythic and Battle of Dazar lore, also doing some Mythic Plus to complement that. And when you look across an entire raid group that has been playing together for weeks, the average item levels are fairly consistent. And so there's a lot more gear than ever before. It feels like there's more variation, but in terms of the power level that you have and your ability to actually do the content you want to do, we don't think that this is getting in the way of that. Now, if it feels bad, it feels bad. And that's something that we're still constantly talking about. How can we reduce that feeling without also getting to a very formulaic world where the extreme version of everything's on a vendor, and a couple months down the line, you have everything that you want, have no goals, have nothing that you are excited to get, nothing that you're working towards anymore, which isn't a great place to be either. Because having rewards, having the hope of something that's going to be an upgrade when you kill a boss or when you open your weekly chest, there's value to that.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I can certainly understand. Like, you're talking a lot about like more availability of that. That does help counterbalance that RNG a little bit. So I can see the direction that we're heading there at the very least.
Yeah.
Cool. Let's move on. Next question comes from Bearfat, who says, many players feel that gear resets are too frequent and too steep. Will anything be done to address this issue? Wow, I cannot speak today. That's what we're breaking in the new setup, is that I'm no longer capable of speaking. Many players feel that gear resets are too frequent and too steep. Will anything be done to address this issue going forward? So talking about the idea of new raid tier comes out, and now I have to go and collect a whole bunch of new gear, or a new Mythic Plus season starts. Any of the above, where now all the gear that I had previously, players feeling like that is now no longer useful gear anymore because it's all being replaced very quickly.
I think this is, we've talked about this in these Q&As a couple of times in the past. It's a double-edged sword, right? These so-called gear resets, with every new tier, every new season, every 5 or 6 months within a patch, there's definitely this sense that it wipes away some of your accomplishment, and that your hard-won loot from the last tier feels less special as a result. The flip side is that we've experimented over the years with different levels of item level gaps between raid zones, between successive PvP seasons, and we've settled on a number in the 25 to 30 range, which is where we've been for the past several years, as kind of the minimum required for upgrades going into new content to feel good. And I think I've used this example in some discussion in the past. There are plenty of guilds, using raiding as a specific example, that span 2 tiers, 2 difficulties of content over the course of an entire 4 or 5 month tier that might work their way through Heroic and begin Mythic, and then finish, with 4 or 5 Mythic bosses killed after several weeks. But they're not a guild that's going to jump in and start having success in Mythic the first week that Mythic opens of the new tier. They're not the Method of the World, or Limit, or Exorcist, or what have you. And so that's an aspirational goal for them several months down the line. But they have a bunch of Mythic gear from the last tier because they still collectively killed, they have several dozen boss kills over the course of those weeks.
Yeah.
And so if they come into the new tier, if, Ashar's Palace becomes available, and folks who did some Mythic Battle of Dazar lore are starting on Heroic Ashar's Palace, killing bosses that aren't trivial for them, they're working their way through the zone over the course of a few weeks, and the drops are side grades at best, that doesn't feel particularly rewarding because you just worked hard to learn a new fight and got nothing for it. Also, your power level isn't being pushed forward at all because these are side grades. And so we've settled into a space where, if you have Mythic Battle of Dazar lore gear, normal Ashara gear in Rise of Ashara will be, kind of irrelevant to you, but Heroic gear will matter and will be an upgrade. And that's sort of where everything has ended up. And I think we're probably going to stick with something along those lines for the foreseeable future.
It's interesting, too, thinking about it, like, a lot of the people who are probably watching this Q&A, a lot of the people who are sending these questions are going to find themselves falling into that more engaged, more hardcore end of the spectrum. So a lot of the people that are sending in the questions like this are feeling that sort of issue you described, where they're getting in and they're clearing the new fights relatively quickly, and thus they're getting all the new loot, not necessarily falling into that earlier bucket, where, if I'm not mistaken, I think most people actually end up who are just playing the game normally, not super hardcore top end. It's interesting to think about it just from a perspective of the questions coming in from the Q&A versus the overall experience. And I'm not trying to, it sounds kind of like I'm making an excuse right now. That's not what I'm trying to do. It's more along the lines of just understanding.
But by definition, if you're sitting here watching us on Twitch right now, you are probably more hardcore than the average World of Warcraft player.
That's what I was trying to say.
And that's just the nature of it.
Yep. I'm going to move on before I say anything else that's stupid. This question comes from... Spoilers, I'm going to say more stupid things. That's just how this works. This question comes from Faith, who says, it was mentioned before that fun is the ultimate metric that drives the game forward. What are some qualitative and quantitative methods that are utilized to measure not only participation, but actual enjoyment? So the idea of how do you measure fun in World of Warcraft? How do you look at something and say, okay, this thing that we've created, this is fun, versus this is something that people are doing just because it's good.
Exactly. I wish it was simple and quantifiable, but I mean, I think, this was a comment I think I made in the Reddit AMA that I did last fall in September. And this was just to clarify that comment. It was more pushing back against the idea that we're ever doing something driven solely by some external metric like monthly active users or daily active users or hours played. I think the community, especially recently, has discussed that and maybe fixated on those metrics because you hear them in investor calls. You're listening to the Activision earnings call every quarter, and you hear discussion of MAUs as an acronym. That's because that's consistent language when you're trying to compare and aggregate a bunch of different products across the entire Activision Blizzard portfolio, including mobile titles, free-to-play games, console games, and a subscription game like WoW, and kind of translate that into language that the investor community can understand. But that's how things are thought of at a investor analyst Wall Street level. That's not what's motivating us as we're making the game. I think if the number of times I've heard the phrase monthly active user or daily active user among the WoW development team, like I can count on my hand basically, and most of them were just in the last 2 minutes. But no, we would never do something, like if we do something that makes people spend more time in the short term, but isn't fun and isn't frustrating and is burning them out, that's not a successful design. That's a terrible design. We have no incentive to want to do that. All we want to do is to make a game that is as engaging and fun as possible. And the way measuring that can be tricky. I think this is something we've talked about going way, way back. If there's a piece of content that is over rewarding or has a risk-reward ratio that's kind of out of whack with the rest of the game, we're going to see huge participation levels for it. Like, this goes all the way back to Burning Crusade. We called it back then the quote-unquote Mechanar problem. Like, Mechanar was the shortest, easiest dungeon in Burning Crusade. Everyone ran that dungeon to get their badges of justice for their gear at the time. And was it the most fun dungeon? No. Like, we wouldn't look at, if we were looking at analytics and saying, okay, we just need to make a whole bunch more dungeons exactly like Mechanar.
Yeah, no.
No, it's just that it was over-rewarding for what it was, and everyone felt forced to do it.
Yeah, it was fast. There were like 3 bosses that you could clear the whole thing in like 10 minutes.
Exactly. So I think things that we're looking at qualitatively, it's feedback. It's reading forums, reading Twitter, Reddit, other community sites. Are people enjoying the game? Are people frustrated? Obviously, we've heard a lot of frustration over the past few months. That's something we've actively been discussing, always working to address, always working to understand the root causes of and shore those up. Quantitatively, I think there is some value to just how much are people logging in, what's their overall playtime, how invested are they, and how connected are they feeling to World of Warcraft right now. And I think historically, going back, we've definitely seen a pretty strong correlation between overall levels of player activity, which is separate from subscription numbers, mind you. It's just how many days a week are you logging in? How much time are you spending when you're playing the game? We've seen strong correlations between that and how the community is feeling. I think comparing, let's say, the middle of Warlords to the middle of Legion, overall engagement levels in the middle of Warlords were much lower because there was less to do. People were feeling less excited about the game, felt less like there were fewer reasons to log in every night. And we did a lot in Legion with steady content updates and deeper systems to try to address that. And so that's something we can infer. Also, we're looking at how are people engaging in particular types of activity. If they're doing them multiple times beyond the level required just to earn some baseline reward, that's an indication that it's probably something they're doing because it's just fun, right? If you are, if you're into PvP and you've already filled your conquest bar for the week, or you've hit your targets there, but you're just queuing, not even necessarily pushing rating, but just because it's fun, we can infer that from that. And so it's,
like there's lots of people who will go and do like lower level keystones, not necessarily because they need the gear from them. They're all kitted out in like heroic, mythic raid gear and so on, but they'll still grind out a couple 3s and 4s from time to time just because maybe they're helping some friends out and they just find it enjoyable enough that they still find it worthwhile to bring somebody else through a lower level keystone.
Exactly. Yeah, I think, and the whole Mythic Plus system is an area where we see a ton of replayability beyond just setting your high watermark for the week and getting your chest. People are just going and running keys because dungeons are fun and playing with your friends is fun. And so, yes, a lot of different areas where we're trying to pinpoint this, but overall, our ultimate goal as a development team is to create the most fun experience possible and to create something that's going to make it feel like World of Warcraft is worth your subscription every month, that when a new patch comes out, when a new expansion comes out, it's something you want to come and check out because you're going to have a good time. And when we're falling short of that, that's a problem, and it's something we need to always work on fixing.
And I think part of what you were talking about there and part of what I was attempting to say in the previous question as well is just the notion of different types of people have different types of fun in the game.
Oh, totally.
And so when we're talking about like what are our daily active users and stuff like that, again, not that that's a common conversation that we have, especially when we're talking about the game design side of things, but I think, at least from community's perspective, and I assume the dev team is very aware of this as well, is that there are a lot of players for whom the way that they enjoy World of Warcraft is they log in once a week, they maybe do a couple of emissary quests, they knock out their emissaries, they maybe run a Mythic Plus for their weekly cash, and that's what they do. And as long as they're having fun, that's still fine. It's not necessarily something where we're needing people to log in and say, oh, there's a bunch of world quests up, you better complete every single one of those every single day.
Exactly.
If someone wants to, then go for it. But if you don't want to, then the game should still be fun.
Yeah, there are a ton of different play styles and goals. That's part of the challenge also, right? Obviously, different people are looking to approach the game and get different things out of it. For some, the game begins at max level. For others, they hit max level and start leveling a new alt. And that's the journey they go through. I mean, I think some recent changes that we made just in 8.15 to sources of artifact power, for example, were actually aimed at kind of easing the experience for the so-called raid logger, the person that you mentioned who just wants to, they log on for their guild raid, maybe they play a couple of hours here or there other than that, because they don't have a ton of free time, but they want to stay connected to maybe a group of people they've played with for years and they enjoy raiding, but they don't want to feel like they can't do that viably without spending tons of time otherwise. And so we want to make sure the baseline artifact power acquisition, for example, from that playstyle is at least closer to sufficient to support that playstyle. Awesome. Of course, if you're trying to push cutting edge, you probably want to min-max and get everything you can, but that's a different set of goals and a different player.
Yeah, and that's a set of goals where you're now sort of opting into this style of gameplay where you're trying to get every single possible edge that you can. Yeah. Which is why we see a lot of the okay, you need to be running Mythic Plus when you're not raiding 100% of the time. So let's go ahead and move on. This question comes from Twisted Mind, who asked, PvP eye levels aren't keeping pace with the other two primary endgame content activities, Mythic Plus and raiding. What's the philosophy surrounding PvP eye levels, and what should be the rate you receive them? So specifically in this question, I think asking in comparison to Mythic Plus, raiding, other sort of PvE-focused methods of gaining gear, how do PvP item levels fit into that?
I think the intent is for it to be close to parallel, and in terms of how the loot tables are set up, that is what we believe to be the case. Now, if you're talking about the conquest system in particular, and the weekly conquest rewards that you get from filling that bar, that's a little bit different, because those are a participation reward. There's no increased difficulty requirement there. It doesn't matter what level of PvP you're doing or what rating you're playing at. As long as you're participating, you can work towards assembling a full set of gear there. But that's not going to be comparable to Mythic Raid gear or the gear that you'd get from doing a Mythic level 10 or higher dungeon. But if you are playing at an elite level, if you're playing over 2,000 rating and succeeding there, you'll be getting items that are comparable from your weekly chest to what's coming out of the Mythic Plus system, and tokens that let you upgrade some of your other pieces that you have gotten from the conquest schedule up to your desired item level. And the conquest system also offers a bit more control. Like we were talking about RNG earlier, there, especially in the most recent season, at each one of those steps, we've added more choices to each of those reward pools so that you can pick the exact piece of Azerite armor that you want, let's say, or the exact slot that you'd like to fill out of a handful of options. And then if you're playing at a high rating, you can get a token that will just let you upgrade that to be the item that you want it to be for endgame use.
Okay. Let's go ahead and move on. This is actually a really good question here from AAAMSUW on Twitter. I'm assuming this is not meant to be pronounced. Amsu on Twitter, who said, are you guys going to address the issue where secondaries are more important than main stat?
So this is something that crops up, and it's inconsistent from spec to spec. It's definitely a problem for itemization scheme when it feels like large item level upgrades aren't upgrades because your secondaries are very skewed in terms of their relative values, and the higher amount of primary on the item doesn't justify that increase. I know that there are some changes to how we've built items from, I think, Legion onwards that have also altered perceptions of how this plays out. So starting in Legion, we made it so that endgame items actually don't have a consistent ratio of primary to secondary in terms of how the item budget is spent. At the lower end of the max level item range, a larger percentage of the stats are going into secondaries, and that ratio shifts more and more in favor of primary as you get deeper and deeper into the endgame. The reason why we did this was to avoid the drastic swings and the kind of the bad feeling of having very low crit or haste levels when you first hit max level. And then by the end of an expansion, you'd have crazy amounts, like 60, 70% crit, where you were almost pushing other things off your combat tables, and then cratering all the way back down to 20 to start the next expansion. Instead, it's a much more compressed range, which we accomplish by starting you out with more secondaries and having the rate at which they grow be slower. Now, what that means is if you're looking at your stat weightings in SimCraft or elsewhere, it may look like 1 point of crit rating is more valuable to you than 1 point of strength. But when you look at an item upgrade, you're not getting an equal ratio of those things. You are getting more of the primary than the secondary. So
Right.
It may still be the case that in a one-to-one comparison, crit is better, but the game isn't offering you those one-to-one comparisons. The game is actually asking you whether you want 50 strength or 30 crit, let's say. Now, for specific specs, that can be more skewed, and that's something that I think we try to address on the class design level, so that if there's a stat that's terrible for you, or any item that has that stat is automatically dead, that's a major problem for us. And going forward, it's something we are discussing more comprehensive changes to how items are budgeted and how they progress to try to solve. Because overall, large item level upgrades should be upgrades. If you see something that's 15 eye levels higher than what you have, you should feel pretty secure in that being a good idea to equip. When you get to smaller differences, like 5 item levels or whatever, that may be something that's more complicated decision. Folks who are going to sim their items are going to do it regardless, but we'd like the gap between the person who just automatically equips the higher item level and the person who is calculating everything out to be smaller where it can be.
Yeah, and I guess there's kind of multiple ways to take this sort of question too, because obviously, like, you've been talking about the situation where like a higher item level piece has the right secondaries, so therefore it's better than my lower item level piece. That's something that we see concerns about from time to time, and like you say, there probably are some specs where that is actually an issue that we need to address. There's also sort of the other way to take that, though, where it's looking at, and the only reason I bring this up is because I have seen complaints about this, where players spend more of their time thinking about secondary stats than they do about primary stats, because you're looking at side grades the entirety of the time.
Sure.
And the agility that's on there, or the strength, or the intellect that's sitting on it's just sort of there, and you kind of say, okay, well, this is item level.
Yep.
I guess a way of putting it is that the item level and the amount of primary stat are almost always treated with the same sort of weight, where...
You don't have much control over your primary, right? Your primary is going to go up as the item level goes up. And there's definitely a healthy balance there. I think thinking about secondaries and when it comes to side grades is better than the alternative. I think if we had our ideal for what a spec's weights for secondaries would be, it wouldn't be for all 4 of them to be perfectly equal. Because I think a world where you look at items and it's just like, whatever, they're all the same, I don't even think about this stuff, is a bit shallower than one where you understand, oh, okay, crit and mastery, those are my favorite stats. I'm excited when I see items that have both of those. Kind of meh when I see items without them. But as long as the gaps aren't too large, it's fine to have something be an upgrade, and you're hoping to replace it with your perfect piece within that same band later on in the tier.
Yeah, and I guess thinking back, there are lessons that have been learned by the design team over the years from the past, where it used to be that, like, if you were an enhancement shaman, you wanted a gear with both strength and agility on it, for example. And that ended up being very weird, which is how we got to the point of just looking at secondaries. I don't know, I just thought it was an interesting thing to think about. But let's go ahead and move on. Next question comes from Diki, who asked, when and what will be done to address overwhelming negative feedback about removed portals in old expansions for no valid reason?
Okay, so if you were worried you weren't going to get your central bingo square, fear not. So I think we laid out the reasoning behind the decision on the forums. I don't want to fully rehash that, because I think we can move on to other questions instead. So there were what we consider valid reasons. It's about the overall size of the world, the feeling of traveling throughout the world. It's consistent with what we'd done in past expansions. When Cataclysm came out, Northrend Dalaran lost many of its portals. When Wrath came out, Shantrath lost its portals. And also, it would be an odd place to end up, to have players a few years down the line be told, come to the game and be told, actually, you should go do Legion content and get your dollar on Hearthstone there, and that's the best place to have as your home base, even when the game has moved on to entirely different locations. We've heard a bunch of feedback, of course, and I think since 8.15 came out, for the most part, players have realized that there are a bunch of ways of accessing convenient locations around the world that weren't necessarily the old portals that they were using, but are still relatively quick and seamless. One of the ones that remains a pretty big pain point, and we've heard a lot about, is Caverns of Time. So we're definitely going to add a Caverns of Time portal in our next content update to the main portal hubs in Orgrimmar and Stormwind. So that'll be a portal that takes you right into that central nexus area. So if you want to go do your Dragon Soul transmog runs or whatever else, you don't have to deal with Uldum and flight path to the entrance to the caverns and going all the way down. That should shave off a lot of time there. In terms of general navigation, we also have an upcoming UI improvement in our next update that will, if you have a quest tracked and that quest is taking place on a different continent, it'll actually automatically help with pathfinding in terms of how to get to that point.
Oh, nice.
Like, this is actually something we started thinking about at the start of Battle for Azeroth, when a ton of Alliance players came back and got a quest sending them to Silithus and had that initial question of like, wait, how do I get to Silithus exactly? And so that should also just help in general, especially for new players. It'll put a marker on your map for the Zeppelin Tower or the portal or the ship, the fastest and best way of getting to the other continent, and then once you're there, you can more easily pathfind to your objective.
Okay, cool. So at the very least, it's something that we're still discussing. We're still considering. We are making changes. Obviously, you mentioned the Caverns of Time portal.
Yes.
As well as just making it easier for players to understand how they actually get to those.
Exactly.
Because I think that was a big part of why there was such an initial, like I know it was why initially I was like very confused about this change, is I was like, okay, but now how do I get to Northrend? Because the way I've been doing that for so long was, my path was weird. I was going to Mista Pandaria, going to the shrine, and then taking the Dalaran portal. And I understand why that's weird. Like, oh, in order to get to Northrend, the best way to go there is through Pandaria.
Exactly.
That's a little bit weird.
Yeah, and then especially on the Horde side, there were so many different random scattered portals in Cleft of Shadows that it was like even for developers making the game, tricky to keep track of exactly what was where. I think centralizing all of that into a location and adding some new direct access where it made sense.
Yeah, how many times did I try to go to Blasted Lands and end up in Hellfire Peninsula instead? Question here from the Great Bombino, who said, "Hey guys, when will we see more transmog customization? I would love to be able to hide any item slot. Bear chest Zandalari are awesome. I don't know about any item slot. I feel like there's some item slots that we should probably not let people hide, but I mean, unless we want people running around with no pants, I guess. But how do you feel about this? More transmog customization, hiding more item slots?
I feel like no pants dungeon runs are kind of a time-honored tradition.
That's true, especially if you needed extra rage as a tank ages ago.
It's a deep cut. So yes, actually, we've heard a lot of great feedback and discussion actually really recently, especially with Zandalari being unlocked as an allied race, about the chest slot. And so yes, we're gonna, in our next update, we're gonna add the ability to hide chest as a default transmog setting, so that if you're Lightforged, if you're Zandalari, you're Maghar, you can show off those cool tattoos. Exactly right. If you have a Maghar orc and you want to go for that Grommash axe wielding berserker vibe with shoulders and a bare chest, you should be able to do that. And so we're going to make that possible. We're also looking at our transmog rules a bit more broadly. I think when we started out with this feature, I think 8 years ago now, we started out deliberately very, very conservative. There was a lot of concern around items that maybe seemed too silly, like Cookie's Tenderizer as a rolling pin, even though you could use it as a rogue if you got it from Dead Mines just fine, but didn't let you transmog to it. There's a lot of concern around silhouette and making sure that a plateware always looked like a plateware. I think over the years, we've loosened those restrictions progressively, and you can use your fish that you get from islands, and that's a sweet mace transmog if that's what you want to do. And we have things like heritage armor that are applicable across all armor types. And by and large, we've seen that players use these to make awesome outfits that are a part of their self-expression. And so that's something we'd also like to go do. That's maybe a bit of a somewhat longer-term project than just adding the chest, the hide chest transmog, but we want to go over the full range of transmog options and try to be a bit more consistent and loosen some of those old restrictions, so that it doesn't feel as arbitrary what you can and can't transmog.
Cool. Yeah, I always thought it was a little bit weird. Like, while I'm leveling, I can swing a rolling pin around, and it's okay when I'm level 12 or whatever. But as soon as I hit level 20, it's no longer okay for me to have a rolling pin. So that's cool. And it's also
you're not wrong.
It's also interesting to think about it from the perspective of, that's something that's much easier to add over time than take away later. Like if it had turned out to be a problem where we're like, okay, crap, there's just too many way too silly things in our game, and players are immediately using this to make themselves look absolutely ridiculous, and it's making the game look ridiculous and disruptive for other players who are trying to take it more seriously. It would be very, very tough for us to say, all right, nobody can have fun anymore.
And that's and that general.
It's easier to add that over time.
And the general line of thinking is why we tend to be conservative out the gate with a lot of our new systems, a lot of our new designs, with the knowledge that we can loosen it over time. I think as we can all attest, with things like portals and everything else, taking something away once players are used to having it is a very painful experience, and one that we prefer to avoid wherever possible.
Okay. Next question from Jacelyn, who asked, are we ever going to see increased character customization, like being able to make minor adjustments to height, eye color, etc.? We get a lot of questions about this a lot. I know a lot of games nowadays will let you go in and tweak like literally every single aspect, like what are the angle of your eyebrows and stuff like that. I'm guessing we're probably not heading in that direction, but
yes, I think a world where it's sliders and you can make your scary, super tall Slender Man, probably unlikely.
No fish faces.
Things like eye color. So first off, we definitely want to do more with increased character customization. We think this is an area where there's a ton of opportunity for us to do better. Eye color is a perfect example of we want more options there. Height adjustments are probably trickier. I think with the way our engine works and the way characters are built, there's a lot of things that are derived from a race's scale that make it not quite as simple as just be a bit taller or shorter.
I remember being a Tauren in Classic who couldn't go through doors.
Yep. Yeah. For the first year, I think female Tauren could not jump through the window to Molten Core physically because they couldn't fit through it.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is something we definitely want to do better, and that we're going to be working towards in the not too distant future.
Nice. Let's go ahead and move on. Question from Porter Gage, who said, with Zandalari and Kultirans now released, when can we expect information about the next set of allied races?
So I think when it comes to allied races, this is an awesome tool that we're really excited to have as a way of deepening our storytelling. It's a new type of reward for players to earn, and we're open to and excited to add new allied races where it makes sense. There certainly isn't a plan where every patch is going to have a new set of allied races. There isn't anything coming up in Rise of Ishara, for example, along those lines. But as we get closer to any that do come, I think you'll be hearing about them the same way that you have in the past. They'll be, in patch announcements, in news at BlizzCon and elsewhere. But it's something that we are certainly listening to the community's excitement and discussion around certain topics, where it's like, what would they most like to play? And then reconciling that with where our content is going, where our story is going, and what's going to make the most sense.
Yeah, it's interesting. We're now sort of in this portion of development where Battle for Azeroth has been out for long enough that we can be working on allied races that are tied into feedback we've gotten since the expansion released.
Exactly.
Whereas obviously up until now, it's been stuff that was already in flight. So feedback is super, super interesting on that regard. Another question on allied races from Nestar Bear, who said, I absolutely love the allied race unlock quest lines. Have you considered making them repeatable by alts that could be seen as chapters of the war campaign? I was actually interested to find this out after I went through the Dark Iron quest here very recently, and I was like, oh man, that was super cool. I want to go do that again, and I couldn't. So how do you feel about this?
That's a cool suggestion. I think it's something I'll definitely discuss with the team, and we'll see what we can do. I think there's some technical challenges in terms of how they're implemented. We don't generally, like the way quest lines work, it's hard to make something repeatable if it wasn't designed to be that way.
Right.
But there's no question this would be a cool thing to do, and I'd personally love to see it happen, so we'll see what we can do.
Okay. Fair enough. Next question comes from Elenthas, who said, leveling is faster but still dull due to slow drips of abilities over long periods of time. Are there any intentions to address not just the speed of leveling, but the quality of the time spent? I can kind of understand this question as well. Like you get the big fanfare nowadays, and it used to be that there was at least something that you would then go and spend, like the old talent trees and so on. You would get something and you go and spend it every time you saw that big sploosh and you heard that same sort of, I don't even know how to, gong noise, I guess? I don't actually know how to describe that
Probably
noise.
not a sploosh. But
now that I'm thinking, it's a sploosh.
Yeah.
It's a sploosh. But nowadays you get the sploosh, and then I'm just gonna call it a sploosh now. From now on.
All right.
I'm being yelled at.
If only that were on the bingo cards. So yeah, leveling needs help. I think getting most levels in WoW doesn't feel great right now. There aren't 120 is a very, very large number. It's kind of a crazy number. And talk about pruning and everything else notwithstanding, there just aren't 120 discrete things to give a player, to give a character,
Sure.
and I think the game would be a mess if we tried to come up with 120 different things.
And if you're getting 120 of something, it doesn't feel cool at that point.
Exactly. It's like, okay, this thing is 0.3% better now, and I guess if enough of those adds up, you feel it eventually. This is something we're talking about a lot. It's both for the alt experience, both for new players coming into the game, and we've floated the idea of a level squish a couple times in the past. It's something we're talking about very seriously at the moment internally, and trying to maybe get back to a world where we condense the current experience into simply fewer levels. Like, what if instead of going to 120, you went to 60 again, but every single one of those levels gave you something, always a new ability, a new talent row, a new rank of an ability that improved it in some way, access to a new system like mounts or the like, and also probably speeding up the process as we did that, but getting back to a place where levels truly matter, because it's kind of an empty experience filling that bar, hitting the new level, and realizing like, okay, my crit and my haste just kind of went down a bit, and otherwise nothing changed. Why is that exciting?
Yeah,
that's not what levels should be in an RPG, and it's something we need to fix.
Yeah, I mean, we saw a lot of that with the release of Battle for Azeroth, the people leveling up and being like, my character feels weaker now that I'm at max level. And I know we made some changes to address that feedback, but it is sort of a, what's going to happen in the next expansion when the same thing theoretically happens again?
And
how do we keep this from happening constantly?
Exactly, and things like haste and crit, I mean, they need to go down, because obviously if you're finishing the last expansion with 50% haste, we can't start you there in the new one. But if you're getting new abilities, if you're getting upgrades to existing abilities, if you're getting something along the line, again, as you level, that helps soften and offset that, so that, again, filling that bar feels exciting. And I think that's a problem for us to think about at max level as we move ahead into new expansions, but also for that level up experience and how we're pacing the whole thing out. And so I'd love, actually, really curious to hear general thoughts there. Because I think one of our big concerns with that is, I mean, even if the time investment isn't changing meaningfully and the power level isn't changing, like if you log in and, okay, suddenly you're level 60 instead of 120, but you have the same health and the same item level and the same damage, and you're doing the same content that you did, does that still somehow feel really jarring? Does it feel like we've taken something precious away from you if that number next to your character name has changed? Like, that's one of our biggest reservations around this system. Even if we can make the experience of each level feel better along the way, are we still losing something that, almost priceless just by lowering that number? And that's, we've heard a lot of different feedback internally about that, and I'd love to hear a wide range of opinions from the community as a whole.
Yeah, sort of how do we deal with the notion of you were level 120 yesterday, now you're level 50, that sort of
or
thing.
60 or whatever.
Or 60, yeah, whatever it would end up being. Interesting. That's, to be clear, that's conceptual thinking about, not like announcement plan.
Yeah, this is not a thing. This is not a thing we're pulling the trigger on in Rise of Ashara or something. That would be a bit soon.
I just want to be,
but it's something we're actively discussing as a team, because we completely agree with the premise of the question that was just asked.
Yeah, and so that's one of the potential ways to deal with that. Cool. Here's actually an interesting question. I guess is semi-related. Comes from Vidget Gaming, who said, "Are there any older design philosophies you're rediscovering as you develop Classic that you're considering returning to in the modern version of the game? Things that make the game feel more like a living world than an RPG, perhaps." So you were just talking about the notion of an RPG should feel like you level up, you get something. Yeah. So that's possibly one example right there. Is there anything else that we're looking at as we start diving back into Classic and developing things there?
Increased travel time and removing portals, mainly. But in all seriousness, I think community. I think one of the things that we ask ourselves a lot is, people's stories with World of Warcraft over the years, especially for those folks who've played a long time, people who played back in Classic or in the early days, those stories inevitably involve other people. Not inevitably, but usually, right? Whether it's friends that you played with, whether it was, classmates, or people that you met in the game. The guild that you met, when we see people coming together at BlizzCon every year, flying from across the country or across the world to, meet each other and put names and faces to voices that you've heard on Discord or elsewhere. That's part of the magic of WoW, and that's something that Classic and the community of Classic really did a great job of fostering. The dependence upon others, and I think the modern game is much more accessible in a ton of ways, and we don't want to go back to a place where you require other people in order to have fun, in order to participate in activities.
Right.
But we'd like to recapture more of the ability to have the game be a place where you can meet new people, where you can make new friendships, forge new bonds, because that's part of what I think sets World of Warcraft apart from all the other games that are out there. And it's something that, as we're delving into the social systems and the other pieces of Classic, I think we're definitely being actively reminded of and thinking about how we can apply that to the modern game.
Especially with Classic as sort of a separate thing, it now becomes an option. Like, you're opting into that experience of being required to stand around and find 4 other people if you want to go run a dungeon or something, rather than being able to just queue for it. Having the live game still there with those queue options is great for everybody that wants that, but for the subset of people that are really looking for that, Classic, I think, is going to be great for that.
But then the question is, how can we translate some of those ideals into a way, in a way that's compatible with the rest of modern World of Warcraft, and kind of preserve the strengths of both?
Yeah, it's an interesting problem. Well, problem/concept. Here's another Classic-related question. Comes from Ulrich, who asked, will there be dedicated servers for role-playing on Classic? I don't remember, actually, because I don't remember the rate at which these things happened. I remember that RP PvP wasn't added until quite some time after Classic launch.
Yeah, I think, so our current plan is to have RP realms, certainly in the larger regions, where we have a range of realm types. I don't think we're currently planning on any RP PvP realms in particular, because that's maybe a bit too small of a niche. But we'll see how Classic unfolds once it's out there, and certainly if there's a large population and demand for that server, that type of server that could support it, we'd be open to adding it. But I think at the start we'll have RP as an available server type.
Okay, cool. So that would make normal PvP and roleplay.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Next question from Scar Totem, who asked, is the communities feature worth putting dev resources into moving forward? It seems to have caused more issues than it's solved, and there have not been many changes to the tools we can use to manage them. We've only lost guild management tools. So a lot of, we've seen a lot of feedback along these lines, and I know that we've made some improvements there already, but overall the sort of sense of when communities was rolled out into World of Warcraft and the guild system was moved onto the community system, there was a lot of friction there. So how are we feeling about that at this point?
So I think communities as a whole, I think we very much feel is worth continuing to invest resources into. We've seen a ton of communities popping up for cross-server gameplay and activities. There are everything from YOLO BGs to keystone pushing groups to cross-server raid groups that can easily recruit and communicate and maintain a calendar, maintain a schedule, and in a way that's compatible with the way guilds work, right? So we have a lot of cross-server activities. We want cross-server social groups. We want the ability to be in multiples of them. Now, yes, from a technical perspective, I think we shifted the infrastructure for how these groups were built from something that was native to World of Warcraft to something that is consistent and tied into our Battle.net platform more broadly and cross-game communication there. And we lost some things in that transition. And some of those were granular permissions. And we've worked based on some feedback so far. Early on, I think we re-added the ability to have guild ranks that couldn't speak in guild chat, for example. If you wanted the ability to mute that really annoying guy in your guild who wouldn't shut up without actually kicking them from the guild, you could have a rank that was muted. Officer permissions are still kind of more tangled together than we would like. I think we are getting support back from Battle.net and want to be able to add that granularity back going forward. Something we're actively working on. I think, at this point, we hear a lot of general feedback about fix guild permissions, but not as much specific, like this is the exact thing that I would like to be able to do with my guild that I can no longer do. And that type of very specific feedback is what would be most helpful. And yes, I know that those posts have been out there, and so it's, I don't mean to say no one has done this, but for you specifically, if you are voicing the concern that guild management tools are lacking, be super helpful to understand, just so we can understand the relative weighting and popularity and demand for each of these features, what it is that you miss most, so that we can prioritize that accordingly.
Yeah, then that's something worth calling out for, like, just feedback in general. A lot of times we'll see things about class design or things about Azeroth armor or islands and so on and so forth, where we'll see general feedback of like, this isn't fun, or I don't like this, or when are you going to fix this? And while we can then go and find those other posts that do say in more detail, like, here are the issues, we're then kind of attributing your opinion to what someone else's opinion is, and maybe your thoughts on that are actually different, or maybe your way of expressing the issue is something that makes a little bit more sense to us, and we can then understand a little bit better.
Exactly.
So just in general for feedback, it's always, whenever you can at the very least, it's always best to include as much of that context as possible.
Or just tell us to fix PvP.
Or just tell us to fix PvP.
We'll get right on that.
Yeah, we've got a wrench, and we're working on it right now. Question from Ivy Radar, who says, players that focus on one faction often do not experience the entirety of the in-game narrative. Is the two sides to every tale achievement indicative, that's a difficult word for me today for some reason, of possible... Is the two sides to every tale achievement indicative of possible future incentives to play both factions? I just want to note, Ivy Radar is clearly much more word-gooding than I am. I am bad wording.
It's a high bar. Sorry, John. Yeah, so I think this is something that we wanted to do to recognize the fact that there are two very distinct narratives in Battle for Azeroth. And for players who do play characters on both sides, I think it's cool to have a reward that acknowledges, that what they've done, maybe to nudge people to check out the other side if it's something that you're at all inclined to do. I wouldn't say this is the beginning of a pattern or a trend on our end. I think most players primarily play one faction or the other, and whether you're Alliance, whether you're Horde, for most people that's actually part of their World of Warcraft identity. And so it's not something we really necessarily want to push on. But for folks who do like playing both sides, we have something here and there over the years, right? We had a double agent achievement a ways back for just having a max level character on each side, and this was something that felt specific to Battle for Azeroth, but I wouldn't expect us to do much more of that going forward.
Okay.
Except where it makes sense.
Yeah, it's like every once in a while we'll just sort of, so basically it's not some sort of broad, like, trying to force people into playing both factions thing. It's more of a, like, hey, this is a cool thing that we could do.
Yep.
Cool. Question from Jito, who asked, what are your thoughts on gold as a currency in WoW today? Are you happy with the cost of repairs and the gold gained from completing quests? And what are your thoughts on the prevalence of players offering services in exchange for gold? So it's kind of a lot of questions there, sort of revolving around the bubble of how do you feel about gold and its function in World of Warcraft?
It's really important, I think, to have a healthy economy. I think it's really important for gold to feel like it has value, for a bunch of gold to feel exciting and like a good reward, to feel like if you get some rare pet or transmog item or raid BOE that you can sell, that is something that makes you happy because gold means something. The alternative would be a very flat, dull economy. We also want to be mindful of just the baseline costs of functioning in the game and the activities that are the best sources of gold. I think we've made a lot of adjustments to our economy in Battle for Azeroth, and actually pretty happy with where things have settled out now. In Warlords of Draenor and Legion, by far the best way to get gold was to have multiple characters and run offline missions, and those who did that became millionaires. Those who didn't were just trying to scrape by. There was huge inflation, the costs of everything were skyrocketing, and that was kind of an awkward place for the economy as a whole to be. We've kind of pulled back from that a lot, and obviously massively reduced the amount of gold from missions, but after launch, as we saw how the economy was shaping up, increased the amount of gold significantly from things like emissaries, from Paragon caches, and other sources, so that just playing the game naturally gives you a certain healthy baseline of gold intake. And that's enough to support repairs. It's enough to support sort of the basics there. Now, if you're looking at guild raiding and you're burning through tons of consumables and Vantis runes and so forth, I think there's a larger guild economy at work where guilds can pool their resources through crafters to make items like cauldrons, where they can sell BOE items on the auction house to help fund those, as well as repairs. And so I think we're looking at we want a baseline healthy economy where sinks like repairs and travel costs and basic reagent costs are easily covered by the natural gold that you acquire while playing the game naturally, but also luxury items like the Brontosaurus mount that people who are auction house barons or really actively pursuing gold collection as a primary activity can chase after and feel rewarded by. Second half of the question is selling runs, selling services for gold. I think this is something that has gone on in various forms just about forever. I mean, I actually personally remember, well over a dozen years ago, back in 2005, 2006, like bringing someone along to Blackwing Lair and selling them a trinket from Nefarian for a couple thousand gold at the time, which was an unfathomable price. But people who have a lot of gold in a world where gold is valuable are always going to be looking to exchange that for rewards, and if players want it, those deals will happen. I think it's certainly healthier to have that happen through the in-game medium of gold than sketchy, external services.
Yeah.
That, this way, if you can save up for gold, you can have an experience. I think where it's ickier is where it feels like it's dominating communication channels, where you go in the pre-made group finder and you're just looking for, a Mythic Plus run to actually join so that you can run the key, and it feels like you're seeing advertisements and selling, and I think we've tried to change our policies there to encourage reporting of advertisements through those services. But ultimately, I don't know how we would stop this if we wanted to, right? If there is demand on both sides, there are people who have a bunch of gold and don't have the social network or the skill set to join a high-end raid guild or to complete some high-end Mythic Plus run. On the other hand, there are people who have that skill set but want gold. That's going to happen whether we like it or not.
Yeah.
And so I think it's more about a matter of managing it so that it's not intrusive upon the rest of players' ordinary activities who are just looking to find people to run with without any buying or selling involved.
Okay. We're starting to get short on time, so I'm just going to go ahead and move on. Next question comes from R3 John, who asked, will the Demon Hunter realm restrictions be removed at any point during or after BFA? So right now being that you need to have a character of, is it 98 or is it 100 you have to have on a server right now? It's somewhere around there.
I forget. I think it's around that.
Yeah, in order to be able to create a Demon Hunter.
And you also can only have one Demon Hunter per server.
Yeah, that as well.
No plan, so we're not going to remove that restriction during Battle for Azeroth. At some point in the future, I think we certainly will. Okay. Just as we did with Death Knight, the Death Knight restriction remained in place for a while. I think some of it just has to do with the proximity of the Demon Hunter starting level to max level. And really, the main reason for this restriction is that otherwise, the right way to do transmog hunting, the right way to do any sort of collecting, would be to just make 24 Demon Hunters across all your servers and go kill Arthas, a million times on your Demon Hunters every week, delete your Demon Hunter and make a new one. Yeah. And there's a lot, that's heavily abusive, and you're not actually making the Demon Hunters because you really want that many Demon Hunters, you're just doing it because it's the shortcut for farming the stuff you want to farm. At some point where, a Demon Hunter starting level is not as big a deal relative to our end game, that restriction will go away, but it's too soon to say when that is.
Okay. Cool. Question here from CU Roar or Cool Roar, who says, several of the fights in BOD and Mythic have been particularly punishing to guilds with heavy melee compositions, such as Rastakhan and Stormwall. Going forward, will we see fights that aren't so punishing on composition based on range versus melee? I feel like almost every raid tier, something like this comes up, and it's not always that it's sometimes it's the other way around, where it's punishing to guilds with heavy range compositions because of various other reasons. So I guess two parts to this then. How do we feel about Battle of Dazar'alor and how that's going to be involved here? And secondarily, what is our overall concept of that in terms of raid design?
Overall, I would say we feel pretty good overall. I think Rastakhan is an interesting case because sometimes what will happen is there's an emergent player strategy that becomes the perceived best way to do the fight, or in this case, the actual best way to do the fight, that is very reliant on a certain composition, right? So especially on Mythic, on Rastakhan, you really want 9 range DPS so that you can send 9 range DPS and 1 healer down into Bonsomdi's Death Realm during Phase 3, and they can all surround themselves with Death's Doors and just kind of stand and turret and get out of the face without having to dodge all the projectiles that are going around. If you don't have 9 ranged, you have to send melee down, which means they have to, dodge that gauntlet, and the healing becomes dicier. That's kind of a hard cutoff. Certainly wasn't our intent when designing the encounter, but we're not going to change the encounter at this point to invalidate that approach.
Right.
Beyond that, ideally, there would be fights that are better with a heavy melee comp, fights that are better with a heavy range comp, and fights that are neutral. And some of that is on class design and making sure that melee offers some advantages versus clearly the mobility that ranged always have. Melee traditionally have had better interrupts, but there's other aspects to to strengths and weaknesses there. And some of it's on encounter design. I think we saw with a fight like Mithrax and Uldir, the ability targeting of the essence orbs on that fight drastically kind of inverted the fight from initially being very melee unfriendly to making it very melee friendly, where guilds started to bring more melee because melee couldn't be targeted by one of the signature abilities on the fight.
Right.
Excuse me. And that's something we have control over. So ideally, there shouldn't be a single best composition for an entire raid zone, and you should have strengths and weaknesses, and if guilds have deeper rosters, that can be something that they can draw upon as they tackle the zone as a whole.
Okay. That's also sometimes it's just sort of part of the puzzle of endgame raiding is figuring out we've gotten to this fight and especially at the mythic level. I guess if it starts getting into like heroic and normal and it's like, okay, you need to sit your shaman so you can bring in somebody else. That's less I guess acceptable in that case.
Yeah, and I think it's all this.
At the hardcore mythic level, it's a lot more common for these guilds to have rosters that are bigger than just the number of people that you're having inside the raid instance, or even having people with alts that are able to switch over. And so sometimes that can be a cool part of figuring out the fight as well is, hey, if we have our rogue switch on his hunter, then suddenly this is so much different.
Yeah, totally. And I think there's also a big difference between melee friendly or unfriendly and a hard ceiling on the number of melee that you can bring before some mechanic just becomes like critically fatal. Like those were problems on pre-change Mithrax, Fetid Devourer as well, where it's just like, if you have too many melee, there literally isn't enough room for all of them to safely attack the boss at the same time without exposing each other to fatal mechanics.
Yeah, like thinking back to some fights in the past, actually thinking all the way back to like Kel'Thuzad in Naxxramas ages ago.
Sure.
That was a fight where if you wanted kind of a mix of ranged and melee. If you had too many melee, then Kel'Thuzad just started killing your entire melee group from time to time. So, all right, moving on. Next question comes from Mr. GM, who said, is there a specific reason why BFA dungeons don't give rep related to their respective zones, such as Waycrest Manor, giving Order of Embers rep, etc.? Would love to see this return. This has been a very common request from players wanting to, essentially, reputation has become very important in World of Warcraft, especially for things like unlocking flight or unlocking allied races and so on. Are we looking at the potential of being able to gain that reputation just by running dungeons?
I think, honestly, I think it's unlikely at this point. For certain reputations, that may make sense going forward. If there's anything that's tied to a dungeon, or not every reputation has to be the same. But I think the reputations that we add right now and the rewards associated with them really are tied to outdoor activities. They're designed to be, you have your world quests, you have your emissaries that you do that give you a smattering of random rewards over time. But as you're doing that, you're progressing towards fixed reputation rewards that are on a vendor. And that's kind of designed to be an outdoor world system. If we mix dungeons into that, then really the right way to get a lot of these reps might turn into just chain running Waycrest Manor, let's say, over and over and over again, powering through the entire reputation, being utterly sick of Waycrest Manor by the time you've done that, but also undermining what's designed to be an outdoor system. Dungeons have their own progression system for itemization and cosmetics and rewards, and we've chosen to keep those separate. Doesn't always necessarily have to be that case, but for how we've used reputations with emissaries, both in Legion and Battle for Azeroth, it makes sense for it to be that way.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Like, a lot of people will look back to, like, during, I believe it was Cataclysm, where you could just, where you had the tabards, that you could just basically pick what reputation you were earning while you're running dungeons. It's important to note that reputation was used for a very different application back then.
And right, I mean, you're getting like helm enchants and things like that, but also there weren't really robust ways of getting those reputations other than dungeons for the most part. There may be a smattering of daily quests where you could go to Twilight Highlands and do like 3 Wildhammer quests or something, or do a couple things, in Deep Home for Therazane. It's very different from the structure that we have now, where there are thousands of points of reputation to be earned on a regular basis, just through outdoor world content.
Yeah, yeah. Nowadays, the reputations are used as more of a metric of how much of this type of content have you been doing, which is why putting it on different content doesn't make as much sense, because then it's... Anyway, moving on. Next question comes from Batrafa, who says, Hunters have Hot Tea back. Xalatath reappears in a quest line. Any chance demo locks will get to see Thalkil again?
Certainly possible. I think, there's... part of the fun of the characters that we introduced in Legion, especially where there were more sentient weapons or sentient characters associated with them, those can be returning characters going forward wherever it makes sense. Hadi was kind of a special case because clearly that was a beloved companion for so many hunters.
Yeah.
Finding a way to let you continue to use Hadi even without wielding Titan Strike was something that we knew we needed to do pretty much the second we took artifacts away at the start of BFA. Xalatath, as we will see in the coming weeks, will play an interesting role in the events to follow, and will tie into various places where our plot's going. No specific plans or nothing to announce right now with Thalkil, but definitely on the list of familiar, fun characters that would be great to revisit in the future.
Yeah, and that's a worthwhile note as well. Hati was kind of this beloved companion that was very, very specific to hunters, and really, the hunters wanted to have their pet back. Xalatath is more of this was just a really interesting character, even beyond the scope necessarily of just Shadow Priest. So it will be interesting to see how that story unfolds. I don't even know how that story unfolds. So that's pretty much all the time that we have for today, guys. Thank you so much for hanging out and chatting with us as we go through these questions. Ian, thank you so much for being here once again.
Yeah, it's a blast as always.
Yeah, and nothing major broke during the broadcast.
As far as we know.
As far as we know. There was a thing that happened, but I fixed it. It's fine. We're going to be back in just a few weeks. We're going to have some really interesting details for you guys to share before too much longer. Keep an eye out for announcements on that. But in the meantime, that's it from us. Thanks for watching, everybody, and we will see you next time.
Thank you all.